General Motors is dropping electric van production at its plant near London, Ontario. The automaker says decreased demand has pushed it to stop making the Bright Drop electric delivery van.
Ontario's auto industry is being dealt yet another blow, with General Motors officially ending production of one of its vehicles.
Canada's auto sector has suffered another blow as General Motors is ending production of its Bright Drop electric delivery van in Ingersoll.
A quiet announcement can sometimes hit harder than the loudest public showdown, especially when it reaches a community already worn down by years of economic uncertainty. When a corporation decides to walk away from promises that shape the future of entire families, the impact moves far beyond a shut gate. It turns into a moment that forces a country to decide what kind of place it wants to be in an increasingly unpredictable economy. The closing of a single facility in Ontario carried that weight, and once the news spread, it became clear that the real story was not about one plant. It was about a shift in national identity, a shift that would raise uncomfortable questions across North America and hold the attention of anyone watching what came next. General Motors closed more than a factory. It disrupted the lives of people who had planned their futures around stable work that seemed secure only months earlier. On October 21, 2025, the company delivered an announcement that landed like a cold verdict. The Bright Drop facility in Ingersoll would not be reopening. Operations would not restart. There would be no gradual transition to another product, and no replacement work lined up. Everything ended with a final decision that arrived without warning. For over 1,200 families, the news shook the foundation of daily life. Workers who had spent long stretches of their careers on the production floor suddenly lost income that supported mortgages, school tuition, and retirement plans. Many had started at the plant before Bright Drop even existed, long before electric delivery vehicles became a significant part of GM's public identity. They had shown up for years, believing they were part of an investment that mattered to Canada's economic future. Now they faced uncertainty, with no guarantee of how they would rebuild. Parents had to figure out how to explain a crisis they never asked for and could not prevent. The people affected did not see this as a business adjustment. They saw it as a broken agreement. The sense of betrayal intensified because the plant had been promoted as a cornerstone of Canada's move into advanced manufacturing. GM had spoken confidently about turning Ingersoll into a major part of its electric strategy. The company highlighted Canadian talent, highlighted the partnership with federal and provincial governments, and praised the billions that Ottawa and Ontario contributed to help build a long-term industry. The deal looked like the perfect alignment of technology, jobs, and national ambition. Then the promises faded. GM's message shifted each time someone asked about the plant's future. The company pointed to lower demand, then described the situation as a temporary pause, then gave updates that meant very little. By the time 2025 came around, production had not resumed, even though the company had indicated earlier that a restart was planned. The layoffs, first described as temporary, became permanent. The silence that followed made the situation worse. GM spoke rarely and offered no concrete explanation for its change in direction. The pattern resembled a tactic that companies had used throughout Canada's manufacturing history: stay quiet long enough and hope the government responds with the same deference shown in earlier decades, a deference built on fear of losing more jobs. But the reaction this time moved in a completely different direction. 3 days later, Canada revealed it had been preparing for this moment long before GM realized the consequences of walking away. Industry Minister Mélanie Joly and Finance Minister François-Philippe Champagne released a statement that sounded calm on the surface. It made no threats and carried no dramatic language. Yet in the world of trade policy, the wording signaled a serious step forward. The message indicated that the decisions made by GM and Stellantis violated commitments to Canadian workers and the Canadian government. The line attracted little attention outside the industry, but to executives across North America, the meaning was unmistakable. Canada had activated a mechanism designed for situations exactly like this one. Months earlier, the government created the Auto Remission Framework, a tool structured to enforce corporate obligations without political bargaining. The concept was clear. Companies that honoured their commitments to Canadian production enjoyed tariff-free access to the market. Those that abandoned their commitments lost that advantage. When the rule applied, GM immediately lost nearly a quarter of its duty-free import quota. The effect was severe. Any GM model shipped from a US plant into Canada now faced a 25% tariff. That meant every crossover, sedan, SUV, and truck headed for Canadian dealerships suddenly became much more expensive. The cost of a vehicle priced around $45,000 soared beyond $56,000 once the new penalty was included. No dealership could absorb a difference of that scale. No customer would accept a price spike of that size. The financial impact reached GM headquarters within hours. Stellantis faced even sharper consequences as Canada cut half of its tariff-free import allowance. The government warned the company that further action would follow if it continued failing to meet its responsibilities in Canada. The message was not delivered through emotional speeches or televised confrontations. It was delivered through policy with real force behind it. For decades, corporations operated on the assumption that Canada would do anything to keep automotive production within its borders. The fear of losing jobs shaped countless negotiations. When companies pressured governments for subsidies, reduced regulations, or additional incentives, the requests were usually met. Workers often bore the cost of this imbalance. Lower wages, fewer benefits, and plant closures were framed as inevitable outcomes if Canada pushed back. The country appeared trapped between needing investment and lacking leverage. The events of 2025 disrupted that dynamic. Canada signaled that it would not be held hostage by corporate threats anymore. The auto-remission framework did not rely on emotion. It relied on rules that were established well before the conflict began. And once the framework activated, there was nothing arbitrary about its application. Companies understood the deeper meaning. If a system like this existed, then Canada no longer depended on negotiation to enforce commitments. A predictable structure controlled the outcome. Access to the Canadian automotive market came with conditions rooted in law, not politics. The companies were the ones facing uncertainty now, not the government. The creation of this framework marked one of the most significant policy shifts in modern Canadian economic history. It signaled a move away from outdated assumptions about the relationship between Canada and large American manufacturers. The tariffs were only part of the development. The true shift came from the fact that Canada recognized its power in a way that had rarely been shown before. After the tariff changes took effect, GM requested urgent meetings with Canadian officials. The company had ignored communication earlier, assuming there was no real consequence. Now, silence was no longer an option. The financial projections were alarming enough to force an immediate response. Jolie met with GM leadership and laid out clear expectations. The company had 15 days to provide a real production plan for Ingersoll, not a vague commitment and not a promise that could be reinterpreted later. Canada wanted model details, production timelines, and confirmation that the plant would be incorporated into the company's vehicle pipeline. If GM failed to deliver, the tariffs would remain without expiration. Other automakers took note. Ford paused internal planning to assess the long-term risk of ignoring Canadian requirements. Stellantis reorganized leadership in Canada and moved quickly to show signs of cooperation. Executives who once believed Canada would always bend to preserve jobs realized those assumptions no longer applied. For workers, the shift meant more than tariff tables and trade formulas. It meant a government willing to protect the industries that supported communities across the country. It meant the manufacturing sector finally had a defender capable of pushing back against corporations that had used relocation threats for decades. It meant their jobs carried more security than before. By the time 3 weeks passed, GM's situation had become a case study. A corporation that once treated Canada as a convenient production site now had to consider the cost of disregarding its agreements. The framework that Canada activated did not depend on political cycles. It did not rely on temporary anger. It functioned on rules that did not bend for corporate convenience. For the families in Ingersoll, the policy shift offered a sense of recognition. Their work had been central to one of Canada's most important industries, and for the first time in many years, the government demonstrated that it was prepared to act with force when these jobs were threatened. Even workers in unrelated sectors paid attention, knowing this could influence how future negotiations unfolded in energy, aerospace, technology, and pharmaceuticals. The next phase of the confrontation focused on the deadline given to GM. 15 days to present a complete, actionable plan. The company had to outline production volumes and manufacturing schedules. It had to clarify how the Ingersoll facility would fit into the broader EV strategy, and it had to show that the promises made earlier were not empty. If GM complied, the tariffs would be reconsidered. If not, the penalties would become permanent. Permanent tariffs of that magnitude would affect supply chains, dealership operations, and consumer choices across North America. The stakes extended far beyond one company. The decision would reflect the broader future of how multinationals operate in Canada. The story began with a plant closure, but it ended with a statement about national authority. A message sent to every boardroom that access to Canadian markets would be conditioned on fairness, responsibility, and respect for workers. The framework made sure those standards were not optional. They were enforceable. The country carried out that enforcement without hesitation. Furthermore, Trump's trade war is pulling Canada toward a country it once treated with caution, and that shift is unfolding faster than many in Washington expected. Only a short time ago, the idea of Canadian and Chinese leaders standing together with warm smiles would have felt impossible. The arrest of Meng Wanzhou in Vancouver, followed by the detention of Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor in China, opened one of the darkest chapters between the two governments. That standoff created a level of distrust that seemed too deep to overcome, and for years the relationship carried that weight. Prime Minister Mark Carney met Xi Jinping on the sidelines of the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit in South Korea. Their 40-minute discussion became the first leader-level meeting in 8 years and signaled that both sides were ready to explore a new direction. The Canadian readout framed the moment as a turning point, noting mutual interest in rebuilding economic cooperation and announcing plans for Carney to continue the dialogue with a visit to China. While Canada battled China over canola and electric vehicles, its struggle with Washington intensified. Negotiations between Trump and Carney appeared to be gaining traction until they were derailed after a provocative anti-tariff advertisement from the Ontario government. Trump halted talks again, forcing Canada into yet another uncertain moment. This disruption pushed Ottawa into a more precarious position because the United States remained its most essential trade partner. With pressure building from both sides, Canada faced the risk of being caught between two economic giants. That reality began changing attitudes in Ottawa. Experts noted that Canada's tone toward China shifted dramatically in recent months. Lynette Ong of the University of Toronto described it as a complete redirection born from necessity. She saw policymakers attempting to rethink the entire framework of the relationship, guided less by ideology and more by survival in a turbulent global market. Political voices reinforced that shift. Ontario Premier Doug Ford, who had long been one of Trump's fiercest critics in Canada, called for a more stable relationship with China. Beijing, aware of the moment, signalled willingness to lift canola tariffs if Canada reversed its electric vehicle tax. The message suggested that China saw room to strike mutually beneficial deals at a time when Canada needed relief. Public opinion played its own surprising role. Polling showed that Canadians were now more likely to identify the United States as a potential threat than China. Although negative views of China remained strong, the shift reflected the frustration many felt as the trade conflict with Washington escalated. People were watching Canadian industries suffer and were beginning to question whether long-standing alliances still offered enough protection. Some experts framed Canada's outreach as a practical move rather than a symbolic rebalance. Fen Hampson of Carleton University noted that when a major export market becomes unreliable and punishing, governments naturally search for alternatives. The goal is not blind trust, but strategic diversification. Still, the path forward carries its own risks. Strengthening ties with China could deepen tensions with Washington, a possibility that Ottawa must weigh carefully. Navigating these choices requires patience, clarity, and a steady hand. As alliances shift and new economic realities settle in, Canada finds itself in the middle of a geopolitical puzzle with pieces that rarely fit cleanly together. It is the kind of moment when every decision carries consequences that can echo for decades, and the outcome will shape the next chapter of North American power. And the leadership of both nations now faces the same looming question. It's a bit of a Rubik's Cube here that leadership is dealing with.